but you have to play with one hand behind your back because you're only supposed to be able to play with one hand. If you play with two hands, you're kind of cheating. It's like not fair. So the whole process is like
We'll
you
put
have
Sonia
to.
in handcuffs.
Yeah, she has to do two. She has to. Yeah, seriously, like just back here. Like it's like eat your dessert without your hands. That's a nice little game, right?
Welcome back to Fractured, a podcast by Refocus Media Lab citizen journalists, where we inform you about recent developments, events related to people on the move and so-called refugee crisis. And today, one of our favorite topics, Greece. Sadly, my co-host is not with me today. Rashid Gali got very, very sick.
What are you talking about? I'm right here.
But we have Douglas Herman in the house.
Hi, I'm Rashid.
Yes.
Nice to see you.
Thank you very much for stepping in at the very last moment. But as I said, this is one of our favorite topics because of the projects we have done in Greece. We feel like this is one of those topics and issues that we really want to cover most, as we feel like we owe it to the country to criticize it a little bit, to make sure that it may possibly get a bit better. And we will discuss the situation in the camp, the surveillance in the camp. We will discuss a little bit of the situation of the Pylos shipwreck. And we will do it with our fantastic guests today. Lydia Emmanouilidou and Ludek Stavinoha, who are investigative journalists. And you both recently have been nominated for the European Press Prize in Migration Journalism and Investigative Reporting categories. Congratulations to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, starting with something that I just saw on my Instagram a moment before we started recording. And this is actually an information from 2 days ago that the European Court of Human Rights has condemned the treatment of 3 people on the islands of Samos, Kos, and Kos. And just to give you a context, one of those people was an elderly man who lived in a tent for months without access to any hygiene. Another one was a sexual violence survivor who was forced to live with men for months and then became homeless outside the camp. Okay, so just examples of what is happening here. I don't think any of us has any illusion that court cases like this may really change the situation in Greece. Nevertheless, we have to push and highlight those cases to make sure that people know about this and can spread awareness. You guys report a lot about the situation inside refugee camps in Greece. And I would like to start by asking you to explain to our listeners what is this new model camps on Lesvos, Samos, and Kos that the government is pushing so much for, is building. What are those camps and how different are they from the previous model?
Sure, so I can start. So after in 2020, there was a fire on Lesvos Island that destroyed what had become by then one of the largest refugee camps in Europe. And in the aftermath of that, the European Union, the Greek government said, we can't have any more of these camps, these Morias. This was a camp where people were waiting for years on end to receive asylum applications. People were living in really terrible conditions. There was a lot of violence, as you both know from the work that you did on the island. And there had been plans even before that for this new generation of camps, but this is where we saw a lot of the momentum begin. And the European Union invested something like 250 million euros into, again, this new generation of camps that was supposed to have living conditions and asylum standards up to and asylum procedures up to European standards. And we've seen a few of these camps open already on Kos, on Samos, and on Leros Islands. They're fully functioning right now as we speak. They look very, very different from the kind of makeshift tent camps that we saw on the islands before these new camps started to pop up. So there's a lot of security. If you look at them from the outside, you'll see double barbed wire fencing surrounds the camps. There are these sprawling, small cities essentially of containers, gray containers. Inside, there's very little, on all of the camps that I've visited, and I have been in all three of the ones that I've mentioned, very little shade. At points, they're very overcrowded. In the fall, we had a situation where the camps were at some of the camps were at double capacity. There are issues with doctors. They're not being doctors, state-appointed doctors, so NGOs have to step in and provide medical care for residents. There are issues with interpreters. There aren't enough interpreters. There's still incidents of violence, and so as part of the work that we have been doing with Ludek is looking at how does this promise of no more Morias and this new generation of camps that are up to EU standards, how is the EU living up to that promise? Mm-hmm. And I think none of us in this room would be surprised to find out that it's not really living up to that promise at all.
Absolutely. So those new camps, they look different, but they are also those so-called CCAC, those cold controlled access centers. How does it work with people entering, living those places? Moria was almost fully open except for the main part, all those tents in the olive grove. This was a place where everybody could walk freely. And I don't know, it's strangely or not strangely, but people were telling us that they very much liked this part of the camp, the olive grove, because it gave a little bit of, not maybe privacy, but you could actually escape into the olive grove, be on your own, alone for a moment, breathe, be with nature, which is something that normally doesn't happen in those camps. So how does it work right now with those CCAC?
So the way it works is people are still allowed to exit and enter back into the camp, although there are a lot more restrictions. As you said, in Moria and the other makeshift camps, people could sort of roam in and out. But here there's a lot more security. People need to check out. They need to check back in during certain hours. They have to go through searches. And so there is a lot more of a procedure for people to move about. I think really importantly, these camps are also in much more remote locations. So the kind of things that people could walk to from Moria, to NGOs, to classes, even to the beach, to have a swim or to be in nature, these are not as accessible for people anymore. So they either have to walk really far or they have to pay for a bus ticket to get to where they want to go. So people are a lot more isolated, I would say, and there are fewer activities for people to do while they wait out their asylum applications, and important things that every human would need, like educational opportunities, even just recreational opportunities for children and even adults to have a sense of normalcy. Those are not as accessible to people anymore.
Yeah, just a point to add on that. So in the previous incarnations of the hotspots, as they used to be called, there was a lot more interaction as well between people in the camps and volunteer organizations, including grassroots organizations like yours, whereas that is a lot more restricted these days. So the isolation comes both in terms of the physical location of the camps, kilometers away from the closest city, but also in terms of a social isolation. So these are really sort of carceral spaces that are, I think, very much designed to segregate these migrant populations or camp populations from the rest of society on the islands, and also from grassroots organizations that have. It's a lot more difficult for them to access these spaces. In fact, impossible unless they're authorized, and that's now restricted to, I think, a handful of NGOs.
Yep. And like I always wonder in this context, because those camps are really so remotely. The one that is being built on Lesvos, okay, it's now questioned whether it will be built or not, but it is so far away, and it is basically this out of sight, out of mind type of policy. You know, on Lesvos, the situation was so tense at some point, and it feels like the government thought that the farther they put the camp, and the least the locals will see refugees, the less problems, the less issues, right? There was like no integration with local community. Like, we know one project that was really trying to hire refugees and asylum seekers, because asylum seekers can work in Greece, can get AFIMI and work. But it seemed like this is also done on purpose to make sure that you really will not mingle much with the locals.
But on Lesvos, the location that they chose was really problematic for their long-term plan, because now it's been fought multiple times in the courts to say that it is an ecological risk. So they've actually been blocked by opening up this camp by their own high court. I don't know if this similar scenario, it's really interesting when you think about that human rights violations were not the real reason why the camp wouldn't open and function. It was the building of the road, the danger to the trees, to the, as we said, the birds and the bees have essentially saved the refugees from being in this space, which is kind of nuts. But on the other islands where they actually have gotten the CCACs in operation, did they have a similar, did the local resistance to these camps, did they find a similar pathway towards trying to block them, or did they choose locations that were a bit more acceptable to the courts?
Yeah, so having been on Leros and Kos, which are two of the islands where the new CCACs are open and active, there was local opposition on both of the islands to the construction of a new camp, but there weren't the same legal grounds that we've seen on Lesvos for courts to block the construction. And so those went ahead, but I'm not aware of any islands, frankly, or even on the mainland when we've seen in Evros, for example, near the Greece-Turkey land border, one of these new camps being expanded, or a former camp now being expanded to look and function more like a CCAC. As far as I'm aware, there has been local opposition in all of those places, and usually there is a minority of people that makes the argument that, you know, we shouldn't be putting asylum seekers in jail-like structures. There should be more, there should be better conditions for them. They should be integrated better in the society when they arrive. But as far as I'm aware, the vast majority of the opposition comes from this idea that people want this problem out of sight, out of mind. They don't want it on their islands. They think that this is, they want to keep it away from them.
It is, there are several issues here, because it is undeniable that the human rights issues here matter the most, and this is what we should predominantly oppose, to make sure that people have freedom of movement and are treated decently in those camps. But for example, on Lesvos, the main protests were not about the presence of refugee as such, but more about, we do not want to be, again, this island that is the refugee island, because we're losing on tourism. People think that if they come here, they will see landings of the boats all the time while they're on beaches and so on. So it wasn't even such a big thing. There were no animosities between locals and refugees that much. We had, of course, the horrible violence by fascists, but they were predominantly from other parts of Greece and other countries even. But this was not really the main thing, that like, there are some problems with refugees on the island. It's just, we do not want to be a refugee camp island, right? Because we are losing on tourism. But let's talk a little bit about the conditions in those camps, because they look nicer than all the previous camps. You see usually from above, those like nice, usually containers or white tents. It looks cleaner. It looks more decent, I would say, but it's not always the case. And in one of your articles, you're describing the case that went to the European Court of Human Rights, and the court condemned Greece and ordered them to bring some changes to the situation of one individual. It was a 6-month-old baby with a heart disease, with a mother that was also sick, and the court ordered Greece to take them out of the camp and provide some kind of a housing for them, because it was impossible to really live in the camp with for people with this this condition. So the question is this really where we are right now, that the court has to order the government to take care of people that are so severely ill, to move them out of the camp?
Yeah, it is where we are. And you mentioned some cases at the beginning of our discussion. And this case as well, we're seeing repeatedly lawyer groups on the islands filing individual cases for people who are facing subpar conditions in the camp, who are not getting adequate medical treatment. In some cases are the subject of police violence. And this has been kind of the strategy now, is to tackle these cases one by one to at least address the situation for individual people. But on the whole, this is the situation that we've both observed, both from our field reporting and from documents that primarily Ludek has worked to get from the European Union, that show us that these are not, NGOs or individuals making these claims about the camps. These are the people, the EU officials responsible for overseeing how these camps work, because they're EU funded, are noting a lot of these violations themselves. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the background of how you came to obtain all of these documents.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's what's been really interesting to work with Lydia on this our joint sort of reporting, and is the fact that we're dealing with evidence that comes from inside the institutional apparatus, right? So the Commission is very good at reporting, monitoring the situation on the islands in meticulous detail. All right, there are emails going on a weekly basis, and have been since 2016, from European Commission officials who oversee the implementation of the sort of EU migration management interventions, including the camps which are pretty much entirely EU funded. And so you have officials who are present in the camps on the islands and who report back to HQ in Brussels to the European Commission. And these emails, which we've been able to get access to through Freedom of Information requests, over a significant amount of period of time, they document in meticulous detail the kind of subpar humanitarian standards in the camps, whether that's lack of access to water, lack of proper shelter, periods of overcrowding depending on the number of people arriving, and the kind of the inability of or these emails expose the gap between how this is being presented as these kind of model camps and what's actually happening in reality, where many of the structural issues of lack of shelter, access to healthcare, access to water, and so on, are still very much prevalent in the new camps.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I think I want to underscore something that Ludek mentioned about the lack of running water, because you have a camp on Samos Island that cost the EU something like 45 million euros, that opened in the fall of 2021, in September 2021. It's been, if I can do basic math, almost 3 years now. And that camp has not had consistent running water since the day that it opened. People, for most of the year, have access to running water for a couple of hours a day. And there have been points where the camp has been at double the capacity, like this past September, because there was an uptick of arrivals. The camp was suddenly at hosting twice the number of people that it was intended to. And thousands of people were without running water on a daily basis. That means there was not enough water to drink, there was not water to shower. So this gives you, again, I think it's such a good example of the what these camps were supposed to be like on paper versus the reality of the people who live in there.
Something that is, I have to make a comment here about the water situation, because it was absolutely horrible on Lesvos. When we worked there, there was also running water for several hours a day. But there were days when there wasn't any water, 24 hours without any water for a gigantic camp. And we spoke to some locals about this, and they pointed out that, it's an island, and it's an island of like 75,000 people. Mytilene, the capital, is around 35,000. And suddenly there's this new, almost a city that grew next to it, the camp, that grew up to, 24,000 at some point. So it's the second largest city on the island. And the question is, how are they supposed to handle those problems, right? How are they supposed to get more water? It's an island. It's not mainland, right? So they were saying that it is just impossible to do it like this. And they never thought that the situation will last for such a long time. So nobody really come up with a plan to build a better sewage system, to bring water differently. Like they were delivering it to the new camp with those big trucks, right? At the beginning.
Yeah, the current camp that is still the temporary camp.
Yeah,
4 years in,
yeah.
Mavravuni is, they were, we have footage from our team inside of like people getting showers in front of a giant queue while they're on the water truck. And then the water truck's empty, and then that's the end of it for the day. So some people would queue up for the water, and then, and if it wasn't for NGOs like Watershed, who were doing this work inside the camp regularly, there wasn't really anything being done institutionally, so to speak.
And this is the case with other gaps as well, with gaps for food. On Lesvos right now, there are many people who are not receiving food because they've gone past this, they've been approved for asylum, and so they don't qualify for food services anymore, so it falls to NGOs to provide that. Same with medical care. On Samos, it's up to RSF, Doctors Without Borders, to provide most of the medical care, and they come in with a van, come into the camp on the days that they're allowed to, or set up shop outside of the camp on the days that they're not, because there hasn't been a state-appointed doctor since the camp opened. And we see again and again all of whether it's water or food or medical care, NGOs having to fill in those gaps across the islands.
For me, the problem here is that Greece treats this problem as a temporary problem. They have been treating it like this since 2015, when this whole thing started. Thought that, people will leave finally. And yes, people are leaving Greece, but still, people are also coming. So you have to prepare for this situation. And I have this feeling of like temporariness of them. Help me here. Of something being temporary. Temporary plans, thank you. For everything here. It's like, let's do it right now to just like solve this small crisis right now, and not prepare for more arrivals, for another situation when we actually have sick people because winter's coming. It's like every year it's the same. Like almost nothing's changing, even with those model camps.
Yeah, and we saw that play out, I think, really clearly this past fall, when there was suddenly an uptick of arrivals on the islands. And in theory, all of those camps should have been prepared to accommodate the people who were coming in. They should have had adequate housing, adequate food, water, but that wasn't the case at all. And suddenly on Samos, for example, I was getting photos from people who were living in the camp and from lawyers working with people living in the camps, and they were sleeping on the floor of what had been classrooms that had been converted into sleeping quarters because there wasn't enough space to accommodate people. There were young kids and families staying with single men, which typically it shouldn't be the case, or vulnerable people not being accommodated in the way that they should be. And so I think that was the first, what one NGO worker described to me as the first crash test of the CCACs at the time. And by all measures, the Greek government and the EU failed that first test.
With this very fast note, we're going to invite you for a very short break, and we'll be right back. And today, during our commercial break, you will get to see and hear a trailer for a movie called Citizen of Moria, which corresponds very well with the topic of this episode. It tells the story of Ahmed Ibrahimi during his time inside Moria camp on Lesvos. Ahmed has been a long-standing member of the Refugee community, is a director and a producer. If you would like to watch the whole movie, you will find a link in the show notes.
I remember that morning I didn't say goodbye to my wife and my children. I go too far away and I come back and I see them again 2-3 times. After that I left. I cry all the ways.
In 2014, my friend and I made a documentary about Taliban by the name Peace. Taliban leaders threatened to kill the production team.
از دستش ناراحت هستم زیاد به خاطرش اینجا به پدرم نیاز دارم.
Many times I thought I wish my family was with me inside of Moria, but not in this situation.
Moria was built to house 750 people.
7,500 people in here.
10,000. 20,000 people. It's the worst camp in Europe.
If that camp was full of animals, there would be an outcry around the world.
It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I tried to take mouse out from my tent.
Angry protesters on the Greek island of Lesvos tried to topple a police bus during a demonstration against an EU migration policy.
If they really, really don't want refugees, why don't they get together and solve the war? Because if they solve the war, you'll have 2 million refugees want to go home immediately because they don't want to be in fucking Europe.
Since my family is still in Afghanistan, their life could be in danger at the hands of Taliban.
If this situation is going to continue like this, we are going to face bigger, huge problems.
A pall of smoke hangs over Kabul.
I don't know what will happen.
پشت برم زیاد دخت. اگر امروز برم ببینم خوشحال میشم.
Welcome back from the break. We're really interested in diving right back in with Lydia and Ludek. And so a lot of the stuff that you had referenced in the beginning really centered around the idea that this is an EU-funded situation. And I think it's really interesting, would be interesting for our listeners to understand what power does the EU have in pushing the Greek authorities to executing the EU plan, considering that right now, as you're saying before the break, that they've basically failed this first crash test. So what can the EU do to adjust the reality on the ground?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with this one. I think this is a crucial question, and I think the EU often, particularly the European Commission, right? So the European Commission is the body that oversees the implementation of EU migration policy in Greece, including the camps, and the EU often hides behind the idea that it's national authorities, it's the Greek government that is in charge of these spaces and places, and so any sort of mismanagement that takes place is the responsibility of the Greek authorities. I think in practice things are a little bit more complicated, right? So leaving aside the legal question of who is legally responsible, in terms of the actual operational conduct, the European Commission is very intimately involved in running these camps, and the whole architecture sort of policies that are being implemented on the islands. So what can the European Commission do? Well, they are certainly monitoring the situation very closely, and that's kind of their comeback usually, is they say, well, we're monitoring the situation and we raise concerns with the Greek authorities. But in fact, I think, the record has shown over the last, since 2016, since the EU-Turkey deal, is that the European Commission seems to be rather content with the situation as it is. And the pressure that they have exercised vis-a-vis the Greek government has been very limited. So certainly they have pointed out, we have the records, the internal records, where some of these issues are flagged in their kind of more routine encounters and meetings that they have with Greek authorities. So it's not that the Commission is completely sweeping things under the carpet, but in terms of exercising more political forms of pressure, I think we haven't seen much evidence of that. And in fact, if you look at it from a bigger perspective, they've been continuously rewarding the Greek government through colossal sums of money. If we go back to since 2016, we're talking several billion euros that have been granted to Greece as part of the migration management program, and all the issues that we've talked about have not been resolved, despite the fact that the European Commission is intimately aware. And that's kind of what we've been trying to highlight in our stories is the way it's not just the Greek authorities that are responsible, but it's the EU that is very closely involved in allowing the situation to be reproduced.
I think from the perspective of the people going through this process, they're also really concerned about not just how long it takes for their asylum claims to be processed, but then also what's happening with that information along the way. And I know, Ludek, you've been doing a tremendous amount of work. It's being nominated for awards with regards to data protection, and you're also involved in that project as well, right? So, like with PEDRA, with the personal data collection, risk analysis, from the perspective of people who have gone through the asylum process, a lot of them are worried about what happens to their information, regardless of whether they're approved or rejected or they go through these processes. But what is it like for, what happens to that information?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I can speak about more is the system in the surveillance system in the camps that I have been reporting on with Ludek's help. So as we've mentioned, these new camps, the CCACs, are much more highly securitized. There's a lot more technology inside that is also being monitored from officials locally and in Athens. And so one of the systems I've been looking at is called Centaur, and it's this automated threat detection system that, according to official documents, uses AI, artificial intelligence, to automatically detect threats in the camps. So what does that mean? That could mean somebody's holding something that looks like a weapon. There's a large group of people congregating somewhere they're not supposed to. A vehicle enters. And when the incorporation of the system into the camps came on my radar and other journalists' radar, these were the questions you're posing, Doug, were some of the questions that we were wondering. Okay, what happens if an asylum seeker is deemed a threat by an automated system? What does it mean that people are under constant surveillance in these camps through cameras, through drones? At some point, there was discussion of the guards in the camps being equipped with augmented reality glasses. And again, remember, these are camps that don't have running water. And what we have found over the course of our reporting, that has also been supported by a recent decision by the Greek Data Protection Authority, is that in just rolling out these systems, the Greek authorities completely bungled the rollout and violated various clauses of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, in the way that they implemented these systems. And so there's Centaur, which I mentioned, which is this automated threat detection system, but there's also a plan to use biometric data, so people's fingerprint data, for people to enter and exit the camps through turnstiles. That hasn't quite been activated in the way it was intended to, partly because these systems came under investigation by the Greek Data Protection Authority after a few civil society organizations launched a complaint a couple years ago. And just last month, I think, very recently, the Greek Data Protection Authority came out with its decision that I mentioned, saying that essentially the systems and the way they were implemented were in violation of GDPR, and that the Greek authorities now have a few months to comply with various clauses of the GDPR in order, or they will be fined again. And so I think this is the stage where we're at right now with these camp systems. The next phase of this will be, so how is this data actually being used once they go into full force? We're not quite there yet.
It's very interesting because, to my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I didn't know much about this topic. The system of PEDRA was created for Frontex and Europol to cooperate together to exchange this sensitive data. And I read that even Frontex data protection officer was raising it several times, saying that the implementation of this law cannot happen without violating the EU legislation. And nothing really happened for a while, but as Lydia is saying, something can be done if you raise enough awareness and put pressure, because it is now maybe will be forbidden in the camps. But how about Frontex? Is it still being used?
Yeah, so perhaps just to clarify for the listeners, what Lydia was talking about is data collection and sort of surveillance within the camps. PEDRA is a program that dates back to 2016, 15, 16, and it relates to the exchange of personal data collected from newly arrived migrants and data that is then information that is exchanged with Europol, the European Policing Authority Agency. And that is a program that, on paper is about countering smuggling. So it's basically newly arrived migrants who arrive to Lesvos or Chios. They are, some of them will be debriefed by Frontex officers. So this is a so-called debriefing interviews, which are on paper voluntary. In practice, not all that voluntary. And the information, so they're asked questions by Frontex border guards, essentially, about smuggling routes, about smuggling networks, how did they arrive, what journey did they take, and all that information is collected, processed by Frontex, and transferred to Europol through so-called personal data packages. And Europol then checks that data against its own vast criminal databases. And that data is then stored within Europol's databases with the aim of, countering or combating smuggling networks. So the data is then passed on to national authorities as part of their investigations into smuggling networks, which we know are often problematic because they target ordinary, people on the move. But that story that we did, as part of that story, the one of the outcomes of that was that Frontex was forced to suspend the expansion of the PEDRA program. So PEDRA is still ongoing, but in terms of the vision that they had for expanding this program, and a vision that went far beyond what's allowed under EU law, that was put on hold because of the intervention from both internally, the data protection officer within Frontex, but also the European Data Protection Supervisor, which is the top EU data protection watchdog. And the EDPS has taken a rather hard line in terms of how far Frontex can go in the collection of this kind of information. So, I think that battle in terms of how far Frontex will be allowed to go, it's continuously trying to push the boundaries of collecting, of harvesting this data from thousands of people arriving at Europe's borders, exchanging that with Europol. But there are limits, and Frontex is currently under investigation by the EDPS. And has been ordered to roll back some of the practices.
That's interesting because Rashid told us when we were preparing for this interview, he said that when he was giving the interview, when he arrived to Greece, he was assured that this data will not be shared with anybody else, right? And he was like, I wonder actually where it actually went in the end, right? So I guess at this point, nobody can be sure.
And there's also been like some breaches of data protection that Greece has already been found guilty of, and you were referencing fines. I don't know what level of the fines we're talking about, and do they even care? Like, you know, it's sort of like when you get this little slap on the wrist in terms of financial penalty, they just keep doing it anyway. Like, what are those breaches, and then what are the consequences for them?
So in terms of the fine on the Centaur and Hyperion programs, it might seem small. It was 175,000 euros, but it was the largest fine ever issued to a Greek public authority within the context of GDPR so far. And it's an initial fine that could grow bigger if Greece fails to comply with certain requirements that it hasn't met yet. So for example, under the GDPR, when you roll out this kind of extensive surveillance program, you have to do certain impact assessments, data protection impact assessments, fundamental rights assessments to really understand how these systems are going to impact the people that you are monitoring. And Greece, according to the Greek Data Protection Authority itself, bungled that process completely, was not cooperative while the investigation of the Greek DPA was ongoing. So there are many issues that Greece needs to fix. And from what I understand, civil society organizations are looking at potentially whether other aspects of GDPR were violated in the process of these programs being implemented and used, and they plan to follow up. But I think now we have another 2 months to see how Greece responds and how it moves forward with these programs in the camps specifically. And I'm closely watching what will happen, and it will be interesting because I'm not aware of any instances like this within the migration context in Greece. A Greece-specific program being under this kind of scrutiny.
Yeah, and just to come back to your point about, nobody really knows what happens to some of the information. I think that's one of the issues with programs like PEDRA is that they're extremely opaque. That there's a lack of transparency around how the data is collected, for what purposes it's used. What does Europol actually do with the data? What happens when there's a match between some of the data collected by the information collected by Frontex and Europol's existing information within its criminal databases? What are the implications for individuals who are flagged by this sort of surveillance program? That remains extremely opaque. These systems are very hard to penetrate for journalists, for researchers. So we've tried to sort of detail some of the aspects of this, but I think it's that kind of opacity of these kind of data harvesting exchange programs that is a core feature. Makes it very difficult to hold EU agencies accountable.
And I think this is partly why the work that Ludek primarily has been doing is really important with public access to documents requests, for example, because often European authorities will deny access to certain documents on public security grounds, on the grounds that there's intellectual property involved, when in reality there are guidelines that say that certain, for example, data protection impact assessments, which I referenced, should be made public, or a summary of them should be made public. But we have faced a lot of resistance from at the European level, the European Commission level, getting access to these documents. And on the Greek level, there is in theory a public access to documents system where you should be able to file a request and get access to documents, but it doesn't function at all. I mean, if you get a response, that's a success. Usually it will just go nowhere. So I think there has been some movement. We've had the European Ombudsman come out recently and reference some of the work I've been doing with Ludek in a submission that she sent to the European Parliament, saying essentially that the European Commission needs to look at these cases of public importance and do more to be more transparent around some of these issues as it relates to public access to documents requests. So I think there's a little bit, at least I find some positive movement in that, even if it's just on paper right now.
But there's this challenge that you're constantly up against to just even do this work. And Rashid was really curious about the piece that centered around Stavros Malchoudis from Solomon, who we've had on the show previously, but about a different project about missing migrants in the Balkans. But he became the focal point of this illegal surveillance that was unfolding. The article about how free is the press in the land of democracy. I think Rashid was very particularly concerned about journalists who are doing work in and around these types of third rail issues, where you try to talk about pushbacks, you try to talk about camp conditions, you talk about any of these topics that kind of really immediately put you on the radar of the government. So what is it like to do that work? And maybe a little follow-up or side question to that is, if you are a citizen journalist, someone say in the type of programming that we do, and they're inside that story, they're members of the community that the story is about, what type of protections are there for them to do that work?
Well, Greece, I think we have to say right away, Greece has a press freedom issue. If you look at recent rankings by press freedom watchdog groups, Greece ranks dead last in all of the EU. And this has been consistent. Yeah, out of all EU countries, Greece is dead last. And that has to do partly with the corporate and government influence on mass media, but also with the surveillance that you referenced of both journalists, of opposition leaders, and in here in Greece. I think it is, for me, doing this work, especially when it comes to migration work, you can run into a lot of trouble. I've personally been detained at the Greece-Turkey border for arbitrary reasons. You can kind of step one foot in the wrong direction and be accused of entering a military zone without any evidence. And in the end, that didn't amount to anything except being held for 4 hours at a police station by unmarked officers, who were telling me and a colleague that there could be serious charges launched against us. So, of course, you can understand that kind of thing can wear on you. Being at a landing can also get you in trouble. So recently a year or two ago, I was on Samos, and I happened to get a tip that there was a landing and arrival of asylum seekers, and I went there, and Doctors Without Borders was already there, and I was just kind of observing the situation. But I then had to be taken into the Coast Guard station. I had to have my phone checked, my recent photos, and you do have to legally comply with that request, which I checked with a lawyer at the time who said, yeah, they have the right to do this essentially because you're present at a Coast Guard operation. So these are just a couple of my own personal experiences doing work in Greece. But if you look at just more broadly, I've had colleagues who have had character assassinations, very public ones, for reporting on cases of pushbacks at the Greece-Turkey land border and elsewhere. People are under threat of surveillance. People are facing lawsuits for putting out various pieces of reporting. So it's not at all a friendly environment for journalists, and I would say especially for journalists dealing with migration in Greece, there are all sorts of issues that come up.
Ludek is agreeing. Yeah. Obviously, nothing more to add. Yes, absolutely.
But I'm assuming if you are facing this type of pushback when you're reporting on these types of topics, then someone who's inside that issue without potentially that legal protections from the desk that you're working for, doing the freelance work for, they're totally exposed. There's no real safety for them to do that work.
Completely. And I would say part of the reason why the situations I was in ended up okay is because I do have, even as a freelancer, some institutional backing, and I can say, look up my name, look at my articles in the BBC, in Al Jazeera, the New York Times, and that does mean something. And also having an American passport has been like a golden ticket out of these situations. So if you're somebody who's not in that very privileged situation, you are very likely to have a much worse result and fewer protections, and for even arbitrary accusations to turn into really serious charges.
One of our students was telling us he moved from Greece to Germany, and he wanted to continue his journalistic work. And he actually asked in the camp where he was placed if he can take some pictures. And the guard was just like, of course. And he's like, how about some videos? He's like, yeah, like, what's the question? He said he was so surprised of this, because of this difference between those two European Union countries. And the camp, of course, was better than in Greece, but wasn't great. He was saying that it was still a very dirty camp. There were problems there, and he wanted to report on that. But they were open about this. This is what it is. I guess the difference here is also that the German government knows that people are staying there, and something has to happen. They have to implement some kind of a policy that works for the whole place, right? Because people are not moving farther from Germany.
Rashid does a fantastic job every episode of doing like deep kind of like stalker dives into the guests' backgrounds. And he has this one that he was referencing, saying that you were referenced as like a miracle for the Greek diaspora.
A gift to the Greek diaspora.
To the Greek diaspora. So Madison.
How did you find that?
Madison Hagoradis. Friend, she wrote a piece that went in Medium, and talking about like the impact that you have as a Greek American doing this type of work and the importance of that. And so Rashid wanted to know more about like, how do you feel from the perspective of the impact you're having, or the impact you'd like to have inside the communities you're reporting to, and the viewership?
Yeah. This was one of the most heartwarming things to wake up to like a year ago. It's a student from Northeastern University who's a Greek American and didn't know me, but had been following my work on NPR, in the New York Times, on various US media. And she was studying journalism, and she had to do a blog post for class, and she decided to do this blog post about how meaningful the work that she saw, bylined under my name was to her as a Greek American. And I think for me, it's really encouraging to be able to do work that goes outside of Greece, that is aired outside of Greece, is published outside of Greece, especially in the United States. Because fortunately or unfortunately, I think the Greek government cares a lot more about the perception in the US and the reaction in the US than it does about the perception and the reaction here. I think because of the media system here, because of the control the government has over the media here, things can be kind of swept under the rug. But having a big story about Greece's press freedom issues, for example, which went in the New York Times, is, for me, feels quite impactful because the Greek government can't sweep that under the rug. And it also kind of runs counter to this perception that a lot of Americans have of Greece and the blue domes and Santorini. I mean, this is the image. When I tell people I live in Greece, in the US, this is going to be the first thing that they say, like, wow, that's amazing. It must be perfect there. And so it does feel really important to be able to get this other narrative and this other parallel reality that not just asylum seekers and people on the move, but the people in the most disadvantaged situations in the society are living in.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, this is how much time we had for this podcast. We're keeping the time very close on us to make sure we're not going over 1 hour.
No Easter eggs on Ludek.
But we do want to continue the conversation with you, and we like to do this now where we bring us into Patreon and we extend the conversation. It's sort of like what you see on YouTube with a little bit of an extended after a live show. So we will continue after a quick break.
Yes. So thank you very much for our regular listeners. As you just heard, if you would like to support us with a very little amount of money, you can listen to the extended episode on Patreon, link in the notes. Today we want to say thank you very much to Lydia and Ludek for putting a lot of light on the situation in Greece. I would like to thank the whole team who's here. We're wishing Rashid fast recovery. And the good news that this podcast is now officially a fellowship grant by Allianz Foundation, so it allows us to cover some of the costs of this podcast. And if you would like to support us as well, you can do this. And you will find all the links in the notes. You can do it on our page, you can do it on Patreon, and there are several more opportunities. So thank you very much, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time.
That we like legit are repping Coffee Island and all things we do, but they're not officially sponsored yet. I talked to one of our friends there yesterday, and I was like, "Where's the owner? We need to talk." It's like, we're kind of like informally sponsored by you guys, but how about you actually give us some money? And
yeah, exactly, because you're
put
paying
a commercial
them
in there, and we keep plugging you, but you should give us some money now. Yep.
Everybody's ready?
One second.
Very on brand. This will also be a cigarette commercial.
Oh, yeah. And that's illegal, right? And in most countries you can do commercials of cigarettes and alcohol only after certain hours.
Oh, here in Greece.
Okay.
It's okay.
Hola, Kala.
Hola, Kala.